Hi everyone. I've been asked in almost all of my videos where do I get my 3D assets like my furniture and my vegetation. So in this video, I'm going to show you where I get my 3D assets and blocks and how to import them and how to modify the display style settings. I'm also going to show you two other display style settings, one that's like this but has shadows and another one that's kind of like a flat shaded look. Let me just transition over and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Something like this, where it's kind of like this flat illustration look that has shaded colors into it. And then I'll show you that same monochrome look, but with shadows. So let's go ahead and get started. So I primarily get my blocks or my assets from 3D Warehouse. If you just type in 3D Warehouse in Google, you'll find it and you should create a login and a username, and it's absolutely for free. And I recommend going here for vegetation and furniture assets. I like it a lot. Also, a lot of people ask me for these assets. I recommend just going straight to here so that the people who make these actually get credit. And so what you typically do is, you can search for what you want. So like, type in tree or like 3D tree, or you can type in furniture, couch, sofa, whatever, and it'll give you a bunch of options here. Or for example, low poly tree, which is like a low poly count. These typically look a little bit more simple and maybe like a little cartoonish. So it really depends what kind of aesthetic tree you're going for. I typically like my trees to be a little bit more detailed, but it is going to be a heavier file. So it's really just a matter of preference. Now, once you find the asset that you like, you'll go ahead and you'll download it, and it'll download as a SketchUp file. And once you have it downloaded as a SketchUp file, you'll just import it into Rhino. And so that's the next thing I'll show you in the next transition. So what I recommend doing, and this is actually very important, what I recommend doing is make a completely separate Rhino file for any and all assets that you want to import, because these assets come with a lot of layers and they come with a lot of textures. And I don't want to use any of them. I want to use my own textures and my own layer naming. So I recommend make a completely separate file for all of your imports for that project. Because if you use your main file, like your working file, you're going to get a bunch of layers that you don't want. Okay? So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to go to File and Import. Okay? And you can filter it out if you want to, but it's typically a SketchUp file, and just click on what you want. You can only import one thing at a time and then do OK, open. Now in these settings, you can do the default settings, but sometimes I will uncheck embed textures in the model if I just don't want it, and use group layers, use objects, add objects to groups. This is up to you, but I like to do that. It's not like a deal breaker or anything like that, but I like to do it. Then you do OK. All right, so now this is coming in as a block in Rhino, all right? And you see how it brings its layers too, okay? So one thing to understand is that you have two options to modify. You can either explode the block, which is kind of like a brute force way, or you can edit the block in place, okay? So I recommend editing the block in place because it keeps it as a block, and if you ever need to modify it in the future, it's much easier to change. So what I do is I do block edit, okay? And then I'll click on the block right here. Okay, so then you get your block editor right here, right? Now in here, you need to click on this separate element, right? See, it'll highlight it differently for you. You see? So when I click on this, that's just like the branches, okay? So if I go to my properties, typically every single 3D warehouse file that you import into Rhino is typically organized by material. So like the display color, it's by material. But I don't want that. I want it by layer, okay? That's very important, right? And then if it has a material to it, you can also just go to the properties and go to the material, right? And you can change it also by layer. Use layer material like that, okay? That's really important to understand. Then, let me just click here. These are like all of the leaves, and I can go here. And then again, let me just do use layer material. And we go to the main properties and do by layer. And then I typically make my own layers for vegetation. I make my own layers for vegetation. I typically just divide it by two things, by branches or trunk and leaves. So like for example, I have all the leaves selected. So I'm going to go here and put it on the leaves layer. Okay. And then on the trunk, let me go back to the trunk, select it, and I'll put it on the trunk layer. Okay. And then just click OK. That's it. So you see how everything changed now? So if I go in here and if I change the color of my leaves to just some random color, you see that changes to dark green, and then trunk changes to, yeah, you see? This is really important because all of the display styles that I do, I typically put the setting use object's color. And even if I don't, I still want control over these items, so I like to divide them so I have much easier control. Okay? So that's the one way of editing it. Okay, there is another method and it's like a brute force method, okay? And what you would do is you do explode block, all right? And so what that does is that this will explode it into its own segments, all right? And now from here, what I typically like to do is I'll select both of them and then I'll go to the properties and I'll do display color by layer, all right? Now these are already grouped for you, okay? But sometimes you'll have blocks where they're not grouped, okay? So this specific block that I downloaded, the elements were grouped together already, which is nice. But sometimes they won't be grouped. Even in the import options, when you group it by texture, it won't do it. And if that's the case, a quick workaround to that is if you click on the object and you go to your properties and go to material, like for example, this is on this material here, right? I can just right click and do like select objects, right? And that will help you quickly filter things and you can group them together or join them as meshes and then assign it to the layer that you want. So that's important to understand. Me personally, I always like to edit by block. I don't like to explode block unless the block is very troublesome to work with. You can keep exploding meshes. Typically, meshes take up less memory than NURBS. So Rhino is a NURBS based program, and the SketchUp files are in meshes. So they're not surfaces. There's a difference between surfaces and meshes in Rhino. And typically the blocks that you get from SketchUp or the 3D warehouse, they're always going to be in meshes. And so when you join meshes, it actually takes up less memory. But if you start to explode these, it becomes very heavy quite quickly. So that's just one important thing to take into consideration. So that's why I typically like doing this method, which is the block edit method. One other important thing to understand is that sometimes the model can be distorted. Let's say you accidentally scale the project in a distorted way. You can do reset block scale or block reset scale, right? And you can like click on your block and it'll reset the scale for you. It becomes like the original scale. Then you can go back to modify it. Because sometimes some files in Rhino, when you modify the scale or like you skew it a little bit, it will lose the block definition. So you have to reset the block scale, right? That's another important command to know. Now for furniture, exact same thing, right? There's nothing different. So furniture, again, I can click on this, that's one element, but I can do block edit, right? Click on this, and then these are all separate elements, right? Let's say, for example, they were like all different materials. I would do the same thing, right click, select objects, right? And assign certain things to the layers I want and go back to the properties and, change the layer if I want to, change by, the assign display color by layer as well. So same thing for furniture, it's the exact same process, okay? So just something very important to understand with your furniture settings as well. And then, you'll click OK once you're done editing it, and that's about it, all right? I want to give you an example where sometimes a furniture block might be troublesome. So like this is a great example. Like if I do block edit, sometimes the block can be very troublesome, right? It can either have like, it might lose a definition or it might have some definitions that are broken, or you may have messed something up with the block, right? This is a good example of when you would do, explode block, okay? And then things are going to be separated into, you see how now things have their own materials here? So I can right click here, select object. So all of these are, see, everything's selected except like the knobs, you see? And then I can group those together if I wanted to. And I click on the knob, it's this one, select objects. I can group all my knobs together. And I can go to the properties and change, assign it to a layer. So that's just important to understand as well. Sometimes you'll have a corrupt block or maybe a block that you did something to by mistake. It's always good to reset the scale of the block and to just explode block command and then start assigning it by the layers that you want by selecting the materials of each of the blocks. But that's literally all you have to do. This is the most important thing is you go to block edit and you change the layer assignment, the display assignment, and the material assignment. Very, very, very important because that gives you full control over the asset. And then once you have that done, then I'll go ahead, I'll do Control C and I'll copy it and I'll paste it into my main working file. And you're basically done with like taking control of that asset and making it your own. Again, you didn't create it, but it's like you can modify the display style in a very fine manner. And this is the same method you'll apply to vegetation like these trees or plants or potted plants, to cars, to people, to furniture, anything. It's the same method. You'll do the exact same thing for everything. Let me just transition over to now the display style that I like to do because it's actually important to understand with vegetation. Okay, so we have this display style here that I actually really like. This is actually one of my favorite aesthetics out of all of the display styles that I show, is this type of flat, shaded, almost illustrative aesthetic. I actually like it. It's has like a slight contrast, but things are also a little bit muted and like blend together. So this style is just like a duplicate of the rendered. So I'm going to show you how to modify the settings and get this settings with like the vegetation as well, and how to modify the mesh display settings for your assets and the differences of aesthetics you can get. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to type in options. So the first thing that you'll do is you'll go to your display modes right here, right? So you'll click on display modes and then you'll click on rendered and then you'll make a copy of rendered. Okay, and then you'll give it whatever name you like. I'm calling it colored drawing ambient, but you can give it whatever name you like, right? You'll just rename it up here, colored drawing, whatever, and give it a name. And then you click OK. I already have the settings saved, so I'm just going to cancel, but you'll click OK, all right? Then you'll go here and then you'll actually just set it to colored drawing, whatever you name it, right? So you can see the update slide. Then you'll type options again. And let me just go here to color drawing ambient. All right, so let me just move it over. I might have to shift it over a little bit. Okay, great. So number one is your background color. That's really up to you. I like these type of like pastel colors, but it's up to you whether you want high contrast or low contrast. I think in this display style, it's really nice to have like this like blending of colors, or like this muted blend of colors. So that's number one, is you decide your background color. So we'll do solid color and then you pick your color. Ground plane settings, I do custom and I have it on and I have shadow only, okay? Very important, I have these two on. Also, I do not have altitude checked in this one, right? Because I want the background to kind of just like blend in as one thing, even for the ground plane. I want the background to be the same as the ground plane, okay? That's really important to understand. And then the altitude is just going to be the 0 point. So like, in the XY, if you're looking at an elevation, you have the XY coordinate. That means the ground plane is like right here. So the 0, so the 0, it's on the 0 point. That's what that means, okay? Shade settings, I have shade objects checked. And then for color and material usage, I have objects color and use objects color for both backface and for the color material usage. Now you're gonna realize why you controlling your assets and your blocks are very important, by like, reassociating the material and the layer, because you want full control of this by using objects color so that my trees look like this, okay? Now, going down to the visibility, I just have show surface edges checked, and it's up to you. It's up to you if you want to do show mesh wires. I'll tell you the settings to do for this. Show curves, that's up to you. It's optional. All these are optional. But show surface edges, and if you have curved elements, show tangent edges is also good. For lighting, I do default lighting. It's weird, but I do default lighting, and I do ambient color. And the ambient color, I change the ambient color. It's going to be between like black and like some type of dark gray, when the shaded color almost matches, or like your front face color, like your wall color, your foreground geometric color, meaning like your wall, like what you look in front of you, starts to match the background. Okay? That's my preference because I want it to almost like blend in as one with like this very, very slight contrast. So I will toggle the lightness from like black to almost like dark gray until I start seeing that change, you know? If I make it black, this will become very dark. If I make it light, the ambient is going to make everything look much brighter, right? So that's important to understand. So then I'll click, I'll expand it. Now, objects, you can ignore that. You can go to curves. If you want to show curves, then you decide if you use objects color or not, and whether you want to use the object's width or assign it a final width, okay? So if you use object's width, that means that you're going to change the width of the line weights here, all right? Now, important one is surfaces, right? Because these are all your surface edges. If you notice here, I'm saying use single color for all edges. So I'm using like this like dark red, right? Right here. If I don't do that, okay, this is an aesthetic preference. Let me just show you what happens. If I do use object's color, right? It's going to collapse. Give it a second. So do you see now how everything kind of like blends in now? Everything kind of blends in. It's hard to tell what's what. That's another like aesthetic choice where you just want like the actual colors of your layers to make that contrast. You don't want to read any edges. Okay? So that's like an aesthetic choice. I also like this style too. But the red helps. So let's go back to use single color for all edges. And still just stick to that. Okay? I don't do the naked edges or anything like that. Again, use objects width. That means you can use the layer property width, or you can use just a thickness of 1 if you don't want to do objects width. You just want to do pixels. Now, meshes. This is really important. And I'm going to come back to this multiple times, but for now, this is really important to understand. I am not showing any curvature for my meshes. I'm not showing any type of outline for my meshes in this display style. And so what that means is like, it's best if you show your vegetation or any of your assets in like this like dark tone, because it looks more of like this cutout piece. Okay, I'm gonna come back to this and show you what happens when you give it a width and a thickness. So as of now, all of these are on 0. Okay, so they're not shown. So you see here, this is just a solid color in my leaves, all right? Now, lights, I'm not doing any modifications. Colors for clipping planes, that's up to you. I don't use this for the clipping plane. You can if you want to, like for sections, you can totally do that if you want to. But if you do that, I'll make sure that you get rid of show edges and only do show fills. Okay? And just make it, one solid color, all poche. Now for your shadows, I have everything on low quality except my self-shadowing artifacts and then my shadow size. Okay? And then transparent objects, if you want to make like a transparent layer, you can do that. Like that, right? And then if I go down here, my shadow intensity is at 100%. Okay? And that's all the settings. That's all you have to do. And you click OK. I'm gonna click cancel because I didn't change anything, but that's what you basically do. All right. And this is what you get. So you see, like, I don't have a ground plane here. I'll show you the actual ground plane. That's the actual, I don't have it though. Right now, this is just a background, and then I have the actual display style setting ground plane on here. All right. And so now going to them, so these are all of the meshes. These are like, the 3D warehouse that I imported in here. Okay, you see, leaves, trunk, like exact same thing, okay? I just have different types on here. And when you show this display style setting, the closer you get, the more detailed you can get. So like, for example, if I do, let me just change my view real fast. You see, that's like an elevation, you see? Looking straight on. You see how like everything blends into one? This is just an aesthetic choice. You don't have to do this. You can make your background like a super high contrast, like a dark color, and then make everything else, a very light color. That's one preference, I like it when everything kind of blends in and the shadows make it pop. I think it's really cool. So this is one way of doing it, right? I can also do, let me just move back a little bit. So that's much further back, you see? So right now you're just reading these trees as like a geometry, That's all you are. You're reading these trees as a geometry. And so it's up. So right now the trunk is a different color, right? I can make it, let me just copy this. I can make it, a darker color if I wanted to. And so then it really makes everything pop as like one element. See, the further you're away, this makes it look better because you can read it as one tree, like one vegetation element, right? Same thing if I go to here, right? This is the side view. Let me zoom back a bit. Right? You see? That's me zoomed back even more. All right? So it's important to understand when you're zoomed out very far away, it's best that you make your vegetation all the same color. Because even if you contrast it, you're not really going to notice it. All right? So let me go back to this one. So this one is, everything's the same color. This is really a matter of preference if you want it all to read. All right? So now we can, because if I zoom out, again, you see that's everything zoomed out, more diagrammatic. This is more, a little bit more zoomed in. Now that's like a matter of preference if you want everything to read as just these one element or you want this to change. So you either change your leaves or you change your trunk, but there should be like this very strong contrast of your vegetation compared to like the architectural element. And so what I typically do is make the trunk maybe a little bit lighter, right? Let me just paste that color I had there, like that, right? You can do it like this if you wanted to. And then let me zoom in some more. So that's me like really zoomed in. You see? When I'm really zoomed in now, I'm starting to notice a difference of like the trunk and the branches compared to the leaves. I recommend making the leaves like a dark color, a very dark color. If you make it lighter, you'll start to notice like this weird shading to it. That's why I recommend making like a very dark color to it. So that's important to understand. The other important element to understand is that you need to make sure your print display is on. So I do print display, and you want to make sure your state is on and that your color is on display. So you click on it and toggle it. It'll be like between print and display, make sure it's on display. And then my scale is 1, okay? And I think for like Rhino 7's like thickness or something, I just have it at 1. But once you have that, you just press enter, okay? So the next thing I want to show you is actually the sunlight settings. So if you go to your render settings up here, you can also just right click and add it on if it's missing. And the one thing that we want to update is just the sun settings. So if you scroll down here, right, I have for my lighting, I have my sun on, okay? I actually have my skylight off, right? Very important. I have my skylight off, my sun is on. And then I typically do a manual control and I kind of increase the intensity a little bit, like 1.2, 1.15, 1.3. And I have an angle not too high. I mean, this is a little bit steep, but that's just a matter of preference because I like how the shadows look. But you do want it angled. You obviously don't want it 90 degrees because then the shadows won't be as dramatic. And then you can play on with the orientations as you wish. And that's the sun settings that you would get to achieve shadows in here. Okay, it's very important to understand this. Now, let's go back to these meshes here, okay? So these meshes here, like you remember from before, I don't have an outline around it. That's important to understand because if I put an outline around it, it'll look really thick. So if I type in options, and we'll go back to the settings, go back to the display style settings. And then let me just go to, let me go to the meshes here of your custom display style. Depending on the block that you import, you might have to give all of these line thickness, or you might have to give just some of these line thickness, depending on the block. Some blocks don't have manifold edges. Some blocks don't have naked edges. Okay, so it depends on the block, and you have to test it out. Right. So typically, I never ever go higher than 1. Never. I never go higher than 1. So once I give this a thickness of 1, right? You see how it gets really thick? You see? I'm not a fan of that. And so that's why I actually have it turned off. I have it turned off for this. The only time I give this a thickness of 1 when I'm in this setting is if I'm like zoomed in very much. Okay, so let me just show you. Let me go in here. So right now, this doesn't look the nicest, right? And you see right here, you see how the mesh wireframes are showing? I don't like that. And you can actually turn that off. You can uncheck mesh wireframes and only have the outside edges checked if you wanted to, all right? The only time this looks good is when I'm zoomed in. So let me just go back to my zoomed in view. So even you see I'm zoomed in here, that's still too much. But if I start zooming in more and more and more and more, right? This is when it starts to make sense to have it, right? Because then you can start to notice these outlines, okay? Again, you see this here? These are your wireframes. You don't have to have these on if you don't want them. You can uncheck it, all right? And just have your edges, your non-manifold, and your naked edges checked if you wanted to. All right, that's important to understand. So I'm not a fan of this, all right? There is one workaround though, and I'm going to show you what you can do. So if we have this in blocks, what we can do is we can actually modify this. So if we click on here, now we're going to be in the block editor. You can either double click on your block or you can type in block edit. I'm actually going to change the display style to shaded just to save some memory. Okay. And then I want to click on this component here or whatever component it is. You have to know what component is what. It'll highlight it for you. And so if I select here, I have this. So the mesh edges get really thick in this like rendered view, right? But what I can do is I can do dupe edge and I can select this, right? And I want to make sure I have a new layer for this. So you want this on a separate layer and you can output to a different layer if you want to. So I have this checked as the current layer. Output current, I press enter. So now those meshes have edges that are duplicated now. It's still going to do the wireframe, but I can do OK. And now it's going to take some bit of time. I'll fast forward, but it'll apply to all of the other blocks. That's why I like to modify things in blocks. The reason why I'm doing this is because this gives me more control over how thick I want the outlines to be in this display mode, if I want to give it an outline, instead of using the display property settings outline. I still personally recommend it being a completely solid color. And I'll show you a different setting where it was similar to the previous video of the monochrome section perspective, where it's just the actual monochrome display style setting. I recommend doing this before you start duplicating the blocks everywhere because it'll take much longer time to apply to all of them. So I recommend doing it when you first get the block. And if you don't like how the curves look in the display style, then just turn off that layer. Don't do it later on because it'll take up a lot of time. It will take up a lot of memory. So I have it applied to a couple of these blocks here. They're not all of them because these are different blocks too. If I go here and for example, I change the color, it'll change it to white, right? You see, these are not as thick as the other ones, right? And then if I go here, I can change the print width because remember I said use objects width, right? I can do like hairline, for example, right? So if I go to options and I go to this display style right here for curves, I'm showing curves, use objects width. That's what I want, okay? Now when I zoom in onto here, it's much more delicate, you see? It's not as thick as the other ones. You see? It's way more thin. But again, this only works when you're zoomed in. I'm going to show you a completely different display style setting that we did in the previous video, just a little added difference. All right. So this is the one workaround if you want to do like this display style with an outline. I again recommend not doing it with this one. I recommend just using a solid color. So let's go ahead and make something else active. Turn this off. When I export this drawing, I'll do view capture to file. And I'll do a custom, first I'll do a viewport to capture the ratio of the viewport, and then I'll do custom, and I'll do lock viewport aspect, and then I'll bump this up by like 4,000, like basically a 4K, and then I'll even increase the scale even more by 2. And then I click OK, and I save it as a PNG, and I put in whatever folder that you like. And that's how you have the export. I don't really do the control print for these. I'd like to do view capture to file for this. So the next display style I'm going to show you is actually what we did in the previous video. So let me just transition over to what I showed you before. So this one, you're only using a duplicate of the monochrome view, okay? And that's important to understand. And when you use the monochrome view, you don't have control over meshes anymore, like specifically for meshes, all right? You have it controlling all lines for all edges. So I'm going to show you how to modify this to get like a little bit of shadow in there as well, to make it look like a drawing and have a ground plane. Okay, so this is a completely separate display style setting I'm going to show you. All right, let me just transition over and show you the difference. So this is one display style setting, right? This was the one I showed you earlier in the video, the color drawing ambient. The other one is, we're going to type in options, and we're going to make a copy of monochrome. We're going to duplicate the monochrome view. So if I go to display modes, click on monochrome, and then click copy and give it a name. I'm going to call mine like shaded monochrome section. That's what I'm going to call mine, okay? And then you click OK. So like monochrome section, and then you'll click OK. I already made settings for this. So then I'll go here, right, and I'll click on shaded monochrome section. There you go. You see? So this is what we get. Let me go to, so if you notice, it looks very much like an illustration, and it really shows off the vegetation and the outlines. And if you notice, the background and the ground plane are just one element. So I'm going to show you the option settings to do this. So you type in options, and let me move this to the side. So you're going to make a copy of monochrome, right? So you'll make a duplicate of monochrome. Here, you do that, and you'll click on it, copy, make a copy, and call it, I'm calling it shaded, monochrome. It's up to you. And then you click OK. I already have settings for this, but you're gonna click OK. And then you'll go back and you'll activate that view by right clicking. And you'll do shaded monochrome. You'll make that the active view. Okay? So then you'll type options again. And then you're gonna find that setting so you can see that updates live. So you're gonna have a solid color background. I like to do, again, like a lighter color for my background and then a darker lines. So that's really important to understand, is that you're going to have contrast. You need contrast in this. You can't have things kind of muted together. So you either have a really light background and dark lines, or light lines and a dark background. You can't have it in between. And then I'm going to have my ground plane setting on with shadow only checked, so that the background and the ground plane are one thing. And then I actually, also for this, I'm going to turn off automatic altitude and make sure that it's at the 0 point. And then I don't have shade objects on. I have flat shading on though. And then this really doesn't matter, but you can do single color for all objects. I scroll down here. It's up to you. If you want to do curves, that's optional, but definitely if you want to do show edges. And show silhouettes is optional, but I like to have it on, and everything else is optional. And then for lighting, I'm doing default method. And again, it's up to you for your shadow color, or your ambient color, excuse me, for your ambient color. This is what's going to make things a little bit lighter, a little bit darker on the drawing. Okay? So I like to have them like dark gray, in like the dark gray range. Now, if you notice, sorry, this is the one. If you notice here for the settings, you don't have meshes here. Because when you make a copy of monochrome, it just considers everything as lines. All your surfaces or meshes are just considered as lines. So it only divides things by curves or lines. But if you made a copy of like the rendered display settings, you're going to have meshes as a separate category. So that's really important to understand, okay? So for lines, I don't go anything higher than 1. And it's up to you. So technical line settings, I don't show that, right? So it doesn't matter what number it is. I have hidden lines turned off. If you want to show hidden lines, then make sure it's just a little bit lighter. If you want to show hidden lines, okay? But you have to be careful with that, because then it's going to show everything with hidden lines. Again, I don't do that, so it doesn't matter. You would ignore this. Edge line color and silhouette color is really what you're going to work with here. And so I just have that as 1. And again, it needs to be high contrast. It needs to contrast with the actual background, okay? And it's up to you. Sometimes I make the silhouette color a little bit lighter just to have that pop, but you can make it the same color. It's up to you. Clipping plane, if I use these settings, I only have fills. I don't even have edges turned on. I only have fills turned on, okay? Now for shadows. In the previous video, I had, if I scroll down here, I had the shadow intensity as 0. Because in the previous video, I was showing no shadows whatsoever. Just wanted it to look like a line drawing. So it's up to you, but I think having shadows on here is really nice, because it gives it that sense of depth with that line work. And so I definitely have my video memory usage as show shadow size as, maximum. And then everything else is low, except also for self shadow and artifacts. That's also not maximum setting. Everything else can be low. The shadow intensity, that's just up to you. I have mine more on the low end so that the shadows are a little bit softer, if you notice. You can make it more intense if you wanted to, just gonna make the shadows a little bit darker, but it might overpower the drawing. Okay? So I'm actually not a fan of that. I like it to be just quite, you see that? It just takes time to update, but you see like that stark contrast that you get there? Right here, let me move it a little bit more. Like you see the door? That's the shadow of the tree. Sometimes it can look like it's like an image over the actual geometry, which I don't like. I like it to be a little bit softer. So that's why mine's like at 29% or like 30%. Okay? And then you'll just press OK. And then you're pretty much done with these settings. And again, like I showed you earlier, the display for the sunlight settings is the same thing as the other one I showed you. Let me just go here to the render settings over here. If I scroll down, I only have my sun active with the manual control sun, nothing else. All right. But I think this looks fantastic in my opinion. I really like this. Again, this is a duplicate of the monochrome. The other one I showed you earlier in this video was a duplicate of rendered, that color shaded one. So just understand the difference. There you go. You see? That's like up close. I think it looks great with this view too. Looks pretty cool. Let me zoom in some more. And the more you zoom in this one, the more clean it gets with the vegetation and the outlines and stuff like that. Okay? And you can make the shadow darker if you want to, but I just don't want to have like too much of a strong contrast. So I just remember this is a duplicate of the monochrome view. The settings I just showed you for this is a duplicate of monochrome, very important. The other one I showed you was a duplicate of rendered. So this one, the color drawing ambient, was a duplicate of the rendered view. So you see the difference? Kind of looks like a Japanese block print, kind of, But I'm gonna show you some final exports and just toggle through and show you like how you can make these look really cool on a layout, But yeah, these are just different aesthetic preferences, and everyone keeps asking me how do I import, where do I get my vegetation from. So hopefully the first half of the video you understand where I get my vegetation from and my assets and how I modify them the way I do to make them look the way I want. Just one quick note, you can like make 2D, you can like do extract wireframe or dupe face border if you wanted to, but that only works well if you're going to make 2D in a very single view and clean up the lines later. Again, I like to do everything in Rhino. Sometimes I take things to Illustrator and I'll make separate videos about that, but these are for people who just want to like almost do everything in Rhino. I do my layouts in InDesign and annotations in InDesign. But yeah, I hope you found this helpful. If you have any comments or questions, please leave it in the comment section below. And please share this channel with other people. I really want to help this channel grow and reach as many design students and design professionals as possible. Thank you.